So this morning, a bunch of hands-on previews and interviews for Final Fantasy XVI dropped, revealing a ton of new information. And while most of it was gameplay-oriented, there were quite a few things that came out of interviews that completely shocked me. And to save you the trouble, I've combed through all of them and pulled out what I felt were the 16 most interesting pieces. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at 16 surprising new reveals for Final Fantasy XVI. Now, the first one was one we probably already knew, but it got confirmed, and that was that you only play as Clive through the game. Now, you will have other party members as shown in some of the new gameplay, but as far as directly controlling a character, you'll only play as Clive. Now, on one hand, that's pretty disappointing because it seemed like there were some really cool characters that will be able to join your party, and it would have been fun to play as them. However, you have quite a big moveset with all the different icon abilities and how you dodge and attack and stuff like that we'll get into later in the video, so I guess it kind of makes sense in that respect. However, there is one party member that you can kind of control, and that is Torgal, your dog. Now, you can't directly control him, you can't run around with him, but you can use D-pad commands to control him a little bit by giving him commands to heal you, attack, and things like that. And they also did confirm that you can pet the dog. Now next, they added some really interesting ways to modify the game's difficulty. So when you begin the game, you'll have two options, either action or story mode. Now action will be just kind of the standard normal difficulty, but story mode will give you a bunch of assistance rings. And so once you equip these rings, they can do different things like doing auto potion, auto dodge, auto perform best moves for you, and things like that. Basically, for those new to action games, it gives you a variety of different ways to make the game easier depending on where you lack in your abilities to play games. And it seems like the thought behind this was that they were really concerned for players that were coming from, they only played the turn-based Final Fantasy games, so they want to give players as many options as possible to modify the game to the best way that they see fit. On one hand, I can totally see people getting upset about this and whatever, but on the other, it's like, this is totally optional. Don't have to play with this if you don't want to. And for those that want to experience Final Fantasy in a new way, or maybe for the first time, it gives them a bunch of different modifiers so they can enjoy it the way they want to. And I think that's pretty cool. Next, they will have some sort of scoring system for combat. Now, as you're watching the B-roll here, you can see a lot of action combat. You can see boosts and things like that. It seems very Devil May Cry-ish, which makes sense because the combat designer comes from Devil May Cry 5, and it seems like doing these extra things will give you extra XP boosts after you finish battles. So it kind of encourages, doing different combos, trying different icon abilities and things like that, which I like. It keeps the game fresh. Now, next, it was kind of cool because they revealed more of the icon abilities. Now, each one obviously has their own attack abilities that you can see throughout combat, the big uppercut with the Phoenix and the spinning attack with Garuda, but each one also seems to have some kind of movement ability. So Phoenix has an ability where you can rush towards the enemy and just kind of, go from one side of the room to the next if you really want to hit an enemy or prioritize them. Garuda can pull enemies towards you if you don't want to rush away, if you're in a position you just want to stay where you are. And then Titan has the ability to pull up a big shield and block. And these were just the only three that they showed. Apparently, some people saw up to 8 different slots for icons, and I don't know how many will be in the full game, but those are just the 3 that they revealed so far. And to me, that's so much fun. I love action games where you have different ways to, control enemies and different ways to move around the battlefield. So being able to pull enemies towards you, I think that'll be super fun. Now, next, there seems to be some sort of Witch Time-esque perfect dodge, something you might see in Bayonetta, for example. Basically, if you dodge at just the right time, it'll kind of slow down combat so you can get some extra moves in on an enemy. To me, I like that. It feels just so good in games like Bayonetta and Nier Automata. It's just, it feels so good, and it makes you feel like a badass as you're fighting. So I'm glad that they added stuff like that in. Next, they added QTE events, or, there are QTE events in the game. So a couple that they showed were in this boss battle where you fight 2 smaller Garuda style looking enemies where they come at you and you have to dodge or block or hit at the right time. And also some areas where you have to lift up a gate. It's really interesting to see QTE events come back because these were very prominent, obviously, in games like Resident Evil 4 on the PlayStation 2, and even in a lot of games on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. Now, I don't think this game is going to be laden with QTEs, just here and there where it seems fit. And to me, I like this because it kind of gives the battles more of a cinematic feel, which is really what they're trying to go for here. As you watch all the different footage, it's clear that they're really trying to up the production value. So to throw in some QTE events here and there, I think that's pretty cool. Now, this next one is probably the most disappointing thing for me that came out of all these different previews, and that's that there won't be any mini games. So no fishing, no card games, nothing like Blitzball. Somebody specifically asked about Blitzball. And it's a bummer to hear that, but the justification they gave for it makes a lot of sense. They said that this is a really dark world at war, so they really wouldn't have time for things like going fishing or playing card games or things like that. So that kind of makes sense. There was this term that was thrown around a lot called ludonarrative dissonance, basically meaning that like what you're doing in gameplay is sort of like completely separated. It doesn't make sense compared to what's happening with the story. So the fact that they made sense of that, I guess, is cool, but it still would have been nice to have those one way or another. However, they did describe something of a hub area where you can take on hunts and extra side quests and things like that. So there will be side activities, it just won't be in the form of mini games. And from what they described, it seems like it's mostly combat focused. Like I said, side quests, hunts, and even the ability to like replay levels and do it as fast as you can for scores and stuff like that, which is kind of odd, but hopefully these will still be fun nonetheless. Next, they said they're taking full advantage of the PlayStation 5 with no loading screens, which I love. It's really surprising to see some games releasing on PlayStation 5 still having load screens, especially because some of them are cross-gen. But because this is only going to be on PlayStation 5, they can really take advantage of that power. So it'll be really cool to have that fully immersive experience so you won't have to load in between zones and things like that. However, the one downside of that is they said there won't be any CG cutscenes like you might have seen in like earlier Final Fantasies. But because of how good the game looks, it's almost not even worth it to do those high level of cinematics. So to me, that doesn't really matter. The game looks amazing as it is. Now, they didn't really confirm this next one, but it seems like they may have let something slip in an interview. And so let me read the interview and you can kind of decide for yourself. So as relayed by Gamatsu, someone asked if there were a series of constraints at the start of development that the team said, quote, "No matter what we do, we have to have these in the game," unquote. And so Yoshi P, the game's producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV Online, said, quote, "Chocobos, Moogles, and then some of the ships like the Enterprise. We haven't said anything about the Enterprise, but you know, you can assume that maybe we'll have an Enterprise." And then of course the magic names, also things like weapon names, monsters like Marlboros, Corals, and Behemoth. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the Enterprise is the airship in Final Fantasy 3, 4, and 14. And just to be clear, he didn't officially reveal anything and they didn't show any new gameplay, but that seems to strongly hint that there will be a way to get on an airship in the game, which is really cool. And speaking of teasing things, he mentioned that there may be new summons or icons. Someone asked him about how in past games they would replace iconic summons with, you know, like Ramuh for Quetzalcoatl in Final Fantasy VIII. And Yoshida said this in response, quote, "I'm trying to navigate this question without giving you any spoilers, which is a little bit difficult. It's really hard to say, but there are some battles with some enemies that are very large and maybe things that players will not have seen before or may have not seen before in the series. It's really hard to say without spoiling anything." So again, it seems like we might have new summons to the series, or maybe we'll be bringing back old ones that we haven't seen in a while. Essentially what I feel like he's saying is that we haven't seen all the summons or icons yet, so I'm really excited to see what those look like in the full game. This next one is not like super crazy interesting, but a little bit interesting for us super, development nerds. So somebody asked him what engine they made the game on. And for those that don't know, an engine is basically the toolset that you use to make the game. And so they have an in-house one called Luminous. And then for the last handful of Square Enix games, they've been using Unreal Engine. And so he said they're not using Luminous, they're not using Unreal, and they declined to comment on what engine they were using. And so some people were speculating that maybe it was the Final Fantasy XIV engine or maybe something brand new, but it's really interesting that they're not using their in-house one or Unreal that they've used for a lot of recent games. But either way, the game looks incredible, so it doesn't seem to really matter what the engine is. All right, so moving away from gameplay and story a little bit, more into kind of the development of the game and the overall philosophy of making games, these were some of the most interesting and surprising pieces of the entire preview cycle. So now this next one comes from an interview with SkillUp, and he interviewed Yoshi P. And I don't want to misquote anything, so I'm basically going to play some of these parts in their entirety. And so here's one of the first things he said.
One thing he wants to get across is that when we create games, we don't go into them thinking we are creating JRPGs. We are just creating RPGs. The term JRPG is used by Western media rather than users and media in Japan, end quote.
Now that makes sense to me because that term was invented here in the West during the early 2000s to kind of differentiate the style of RPGs. What is interesting about what he said though, and coming from someone like myself that's worked with a lot of Japanese publishers, is they themselves use the term JRPG in press releases and other PR content. So I don't know if they're just leaning into that to help the audience better understand or just kind of go with the colloquialisms, but it's interesting nonetheless. Now this next quote is the one that really surprised me.
This is going to depend on who you ask, but there was a time when this term first appeared 15 years ago, and for us as developers, the first time we heard it, it was like a discriminatory term, as though we were being made fun of for creating these games. And so for some developers, the term JRPG can be something that will maybe trigger bad feelings because of what was in the past. It wasn't a compliment to a lot of developers in Japan. We understand that recently JRPG has better connotations and it's being used as a positive, but we still remember the time when it was being used as a negative, end quote.
Yoshi P went on to say that he felt the term JRPG was too limiting and puts games in a box, and then they're just making RPGs that happen to be from Japan, and they felt that putting games like that into a box felt discriminatory. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on all these different quotes. One, I was really surprised to hear that the term JRPG had such a negative connotation in Japan, and that it brought up a lot of negative feelings. I think for a lot of us in the West, it's just sort of an easy shorthand, like the term Metroidvania. Like, it's not meant to mean anything negative or positive. It's just when you say that term, people know what it means now. And the other thing is that I kind of feel bad because I'm responsible for pushing that boxing in mentality. I mean, I made an entire video about trying to define what a JRPG is. So this entire exchange was really eye-opening to me, and it almost makes me feel like the term doesn't really matter anymore. And in fact, in that video, one of the things I used to define what a JRPG was its vibe, which is a little bit more nebulous. And I feel like more than anything, that's kind of the thing that would differentiate it. But nonetheless, I'm going to link that interview down below in the description somewhere, so definitely go watch it because there's a few more pieces in there that I didn't include that are really fascinating. Next, the team felt that Final Fantasy was no longer a must-play gaming franchise, and they wanted to change that. So some of their reasoning behind that seemed to be that they felt real-time action games kind of have risen to the top and becoming the standard in terms of big global hits and games that win Game of the Year. And so they felt like turn-based combat in Final Fantasy games was a little bit alienating to some, and so they wanted to make something that would appeal to more players. And what's interesting is they felt like Final Fantasy was a little too set in its ways and wasn't evolving fast enough. Even games like Final Fantasy XV and VII Remake took half measures, if you remember, with their combat, with the ability to pause and kind of have this pseudo turn-based version of the combat, but really, I mean, it's more action than anything else, but it didn't go all the way with it. Now, this may be a bit of a hot take, but I actually agree with him. Now, one thing I will say is that Final Fantasy has always evolved, especially at the start of console generations. I mean, if you think of Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy X, even 13, they're all so different from the previous entry. And speaking of other Square Enix games that are kind of set in their ways, I mean, I feel like Dragon Quest, for better or worse, is particularly set in its ways. And I love Dragon Quest. It's awesome. I put it #1 in my modern turn-based JRPGs video. But let's all admit it is a little stale in terms of design. It hasn't evolved a ton over the years. And I understand that that's what makes these games interesting. They don't evolve, they don't change, they're predictable. But Final Fantasy is such a huge brand that they got to keep it modern, they got to keep it global. So the fact that they're evolving it, I totally understand and kind of agree with what's going on. And the fact that they say it's not a must-play game anymore, I mean, if you think back on the PlayStation 1 and the PlayStation 2, anytime a Final Fantasy game came out, heck, anytime a Square Enix or Squaresoft game came out, I was there day one, and I know a lot of people were as well. And it's not really been the case anymore. So the fact that they're trying to rectify that is really interesting. And this last piece I thought was pretty funny. They said that they have a better chance of a meteor hitting Square's office than the game getting delayed. And so right now it's set to release on June 22nd, 2023, and doesn't look like it's getting delayed. Now, who knows? There's still plenty of time for a delay, but I gotta say, I really love the confidence they have in this game, and I love that they have such a strong vision for it. Now, I know a lot of you probably aren't gonna agree. I know there's a lot of purists when it comes to turn-based RPGs that follow this channel that are not gonna play this game because it's action-oriented, but that said, you can't fault the team for having a strong vision. I mean, they clearly know what they want to do. They clearly have a vision for the franchise, and they have a vision for this game, and everything that I've seen so far looks incredible, both visually and just gameplay-wise. I can't wait to play this game. I can't wait to experience this story. It looks absolutely fantastic. Now, if you're just like me and can't wait to play this game and want to play a cool Final Fantasy game for free in the meantime, be sure to check out this video right here. And special thanks to Reset Switch, Tyler Kuzawa, and the Miyazaki Man for supporting me over on Patreon. To get exclusive videos and other cool perks, consider supporting me over on patreon.com/thegaming shelf. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.